Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another exciting episode of Certified Forgotten, the horror podcast that talks about the movies that other horror podcasts aren't talking about. It's not our official catchphrase, but I kind of like it. I think I might keep it. I am, as always, one half of your hosts, Matthew Monagle. I am joined by the other Matt on the internet because there's only two of us, Matt Donato. How you doing, buddy?
I don't like how I'm always the other Matt.
Well, I start talking. If you want to do the introduction next time, then I can be the other Matt.
Actually, no, I will always be the other Matt because you're way better at that than I am. So you get that duty no matter what.
Fair enough. And, this is a horror podcast, so Matt Donato and I did a smart thing, an important thing that every horror podcast should do, which is take off the entire month of October because we were super busy. So at a time where nobody's demanding any horror content. So things are off to a good start. We're going great. But it's November now. We're back on the horror beat, and we've got an exciting guest to talk about today's movie. So first and most important, Matt, will you please introduce our guest today?
Yes, I very much can. Today with us, we have from the playlist and from the Playlist Podcast Network, Mr. Ryan Oliver.
Demon Wind.
Yes.
Wait,
you know the callbacks.
So wait, I was informed that this was actually the Demon Wind podcast. I think I jumped on the wrong feed here.
Yeah, I might have mistakenly told you that just because I am me. And Mr. Monagle, so we're just hijacking this episode and talking only Demon Wind again.
I wonder how long people would actually stick with us if it just turned out every episode was a Demon Wind episode.
Could you imagine? I just every time didn't tell you I told the guest to watch Demon Wind and we just kept going into it with different people.
See, the fun thing for me on the edit is I just drop in the points that I made last time, just keep recycling that same audio and see if anyone even notices.
Well, fortunately, even though Matt didn't really properly prepare me, coincidentally, by happenstance, I watched the movie we're going to be discussing today last night anyway. So I think I'm good to go.
We'll look at that. A nice little surprise for everyone that will stay on topic.
Look how smooth this is going. So we've got an exciting movie that I think everybody actually kind of liked, which is not a first for the show, but we don't usually get kind of across the board agreement. So we're going to talk about that in a second. But before we get started, we always like to talk to our guests about their relationship to the horror genre. And Ryan, you and I have had a lot of interactions online. We're in a terribly going fantasy football league together, so we've got a lot of back and forth throughout the day. But the one thing that I don't know is I know that you write a lot about horror. I know that that's something that you consider, yourself to be a good writer on, and you certainly are. But I don't know how that started for you. So talk to me a little bit about your relationship to the horror genre, when it started, when you found it something that you could talk about and write about, and feel like you belonged as part of this community as well.
Sure thing. Well, I think the earliest that I got into the horror genre, and I wouldn't say this particular set of movies are horror per se, but they have a certain sort of spooky quality to them that I think definitely fueled my curiosity at a young age. Some of the early, I'm referring to some of the early Tim Burton movies. At a very young age, watched Nightmare Before Christmas, Edward Scissorhands. Even the first Batman has some elements of horror, again, even though they're not necessarily horror movies. But I think my first real entry into the genre that I watched far too young was the first Nightmare on Elm Street. I think that was the one that it kept me awake at night. It kept me a little terrified at the time, but there was something about it and something so sort of dreamy, no pun intended, but like really, really interesting about it that kept me going back. And that's sort of my entry point into the genre. And of course, there were other classics. Probably, I'd say at a young age that I watched, like Halloween, probably Texas Chainsaw a little bit later. So those were probably the early ones, of course, because Halloween was on TV pretty much around every Halloween, and so I watched that as well. Sorry for talking in circles, but that's it. Basically, all starts with Nightmare on Elm Street, I would say.
I like how many unintentional Nightmare on Elm Street puns you just made without even trying. You're like, kept me awake at night. It was the dream. Blah blah. I'm just going on and on. Like, does he know he's doing this?
I didn't know that was not planned. It just seems to happen. Just seemed to happen that way.
So as you were kind of getting to know the horror genre, what did you find yourself drawn to as sort of the things about horror movies that you like? Because Matt and I always talk about the fact that I'm drawn, our types are very well known. I'm drawn to sort of slow moving grief and guilt, a lot of psychological horror. Donato is drawn to all horror, but I would say specifically, horror comedies, stuff with a lot of really out there practical effects. Goofy gore is more his jam. So where do you fall on the broad spectrum of every type of horror genre and subgenre that exists?
I would probably swing more on your spectrum, Monocle. I do like the more psychological aspects of horror, about grief and about, to me, I feel like that genre, I don't want to say more than any other, but really can help people understand and process the feelings that they're feeling. Like, it's kind of like, it's kind of like comedy a little bit in that way, where people say, like, the best way to get your message across to people is to make them laugh, and then that message therefore might stick. And I'd say it's the same thing with horror. If you scare, startle, because life as a whole is just horrible and horrific, and so to reflect that mirror to people and show that, hey, there's other people going through what you might be going through, can really help stick that message. But that isn't to say that I don't enjoy certain horror comedies and goofy, gory, over the top practical effects. We are going to be talking about a slasher film later on here, and I definitely have an affection for that subgenre of horror as well. So I'm not I'm not turning my nose up at any other type of horror, but I do tend to prefer the more slow burning, moodier, like pieces such as what you're referring to, Monocle.
Donato, you have a rebuttal? I'm giving you a window here to talk about your jam.
I mean, I was going to, but I feel like it, like you said, it is so well known that I'm for the slow burns. Don't get me wrong here. Like, we talked about Sauna. You opened my eyes to that. I was the one that recommended, Satyr and these other films to you. So it's not that I don't love the slow burn, but yes, I will admit that, and everyone knows on this podcast, how many times do I talk about Demon Wind? How many times do I talk about that ridiculousness? There's no rebuttal needed. It's always my taste. But I am very curious to talk about Party Hard, Die Young when we get to it, because seeing your tweets, Mr. Monagle, and Ryan too, I mean, I'm surprised we're all kind of in agreement here. I thought Party Hard was going to be a total Donato movie, and it was going to be a harder sell for you guys, but I'm excited to talk about it here.
It's going to be fun. And I should say, as just a little bit of cross promotion, Matt Donato just finished putting together a list of the top 100 horror films of the decade. And while it is in vogue to sort of bash on him and his tastes, both on and off this podcast, I don't think you'll find a list that captures the full diversity of the horror genre, both demographically, nationally, national cinemas, subgenres, and types. Like, they're all represented. They're all intermingled in a really good way. So go to Slash Film, check out Matt's list. I've complimented him once on today's episode. I'm not going to do it again. And
I'm going to thank you for that, because I do appreciate your support through all this. And I did want to say before, when you said we took October off, not to, sarcastically saying not putting out October content. I mean, that was because we were both busting our asses off actually writing October content. And I do apologize to the listeners if we have built somewhat of a fan base and we let you down, but I had to work on 100 best of decade list for Slash Film that you should all go read at this point. Please do support me.
Thankfully, you only needed to watch those 100 movies though, because you knew exactly what the list was going to be.
Exactly. I only those 100. I haven't seen any other ones. And I mean, according to the comments, actually, though, I haven't seen anything else. So let's not even go into that.
Last question for you, Ryan, before we talk about the movie. You, congratulations, are a new dad.
Thank you.
And we were talking actually with Anya Stanley, who was a previous guest on this podcast, about that parenting horror intersection and how you find yourself thinking about the genre and how it changes. Obviously, these aren't questions you need to grapple with right now, because I don't imagine you're sitting your newborn child down to watch Nightmare on Elm Street and being like, do you think that was too much? Can you process that? But I'm sure it's things you've thought about. I'm sure it's things you've talked about with your partner. So now that you're responsible for a living human being, what do you think? How does that change kind of how you think about the consumption of media and violent media, and when you might be interested in introducing your kid to some of these movies that helped influence you?
It hasn't really changed. And thank you again for the congratulations. And it hasn't really changed how I feel about, I guess, violent media, so to speak. Consumption, maybe, because when you have, we're so inundated with screen time, especially both in our field and just all of that. That one thing I've been cognizant of is like how much screen time will my child have like further down the road. But as far as like specific specific introduction to the genre. Um, and my wife and I have talked about this and debated this because I think her side, we were brought up very different in that way, where like my parents were a little younger when they had me, and so I wasn't one of those, you know, kids who they're like, oh, let your kid watch whatever at a certain age. But they did what they, or let me watch what they thought was appropriate at the time, even if maybe it wasn't. Um, my wife's parents were a little bit older, and so therefore there were like, she was more limited on things that she watched at a certain age. So we've had that discussion about like not just horror, but what is appropriate at certain ages. But I think what we've come down to is a pretty good agreement in terms of like, in terms of like kid friendly horror. I think I already mentioned Nightmare on, or not Nightmare on Elm Street, excuse me, like Nightmare Before Christmas and things like that that have a little bit more edge to them for a kids movie, or like your Leicas, like Coraline or Paranorman. That like that would be the probably the best introduction, and then one I'd say probably like 10 or so start introducing the Nightmare on Elm Streets, so those ones that they're not too extreme, they may be even a little dated, they, you know, your kid may even think they're a little silly, but that would be the age to be like, okay, this is the movies that dad liked for these reasons, and you know, have a discussion about it. So we're still in those talks, but or just finding things that even if they're maybe like that are kid friendly but still resonate in a thematic way. This completely was not in preparation for this podcast, but around Halloween, my wife wanted to put on like a kid friendly horror movie, like that we watched when we were younger, and so I threw on. I rented Casper, the 1995 Casper, which I had not seen probably since. I know I wore that VHS tape out as a kid, but I have not seen it since I was a kid. And it's definitely a little dated, and there's a lot of like dead puns that kind of wear on you. But I was really taken and surprised by how well that movie deals with grief and the afterlife in a way that's palpable for a kid, but it's not condescending either. And so like looking at things like that, that are not like condescending for your kid, but actually can show that they can grasp those themes and that they're capable of doing so.
You know, I kind of liked A House with a Clock in Its Walls as a
haven't seen
recent
that.
version. I know it has its haters. I know it isn't everyone's kind of taste of kid-friendly horror. But like you were saying, just thinking off the top of my head, and that kind of fantastical movie you can watch and get the genre elements, but still watch it with your children and have like good enough time. I was impressed with A House with a Clock on Its Walls, just on that merit.
I'll have to check it out because I didn't for the last however long. If it's something that I never covered for a site, I usually wouldn't see the kid friendly horror, not for any reason other than just I would never get to it. But I know now in the next few years I'm going to have to be watching those movies anyway. So now would probably be a good time to pre-screen that. But I heard good things about it. I'm not traditionally a fan of Eli Roth, and I think that's the other reason I didn't watch the movie. But I have heard from you, Donato, and from others that it's a worthwhile movie. So I'm definitely going to check it out.
And then also, while we're on the topic of the conversation, sorry to cut you off, Mr. Monagle, but did anyone read Jason Zienemann's article in New York Times about this very topic?
I haven't. No.
Okay.
I bookmarked it, but I haven't read it.
You did? Okay, yeah. So Jason Zienemann wrote this piece. Basically, the title of it is "I Showed My 7-Year-Old Daughter Jaws, and I Regret Nothing." And he goes into this whole basically like mentality of he likes showing his daughter these scary films at a young age because number one, you know, we outgrow horror in a way, and we find things less scary as time goes on. And then not only that, but basically, kids' minds are more susceptible to horror. And they can watch these films, and there's an art to being scared. And not only that, but it unlocks these like analytical synapses in kids' minds. And like, yeah, being scared is terrible, and being scared is something that we associate with a bad feeling. But it actually works in the reverse, and it makes kids more aware, and it makes kids more in tune with these things. And you know, to have such an early age of getting into grief and horror and things of that nature, I don't know. It was really just a really interesting read. So I would suggest everyone take a look at that piece about introducing children to horror and seeing what age you would do that at.
I cannot wait to check that piece. I did see the headline, and I think I saw it shared, maybe from you, Donato. But I look forward to that, and apologize to you guys and to our listeners for the crying baby in the background. Speaking of introducing kids to horror, so
there might be some editing magic that can take that out.
Yeah, if you didn't hear a baby, listeners, it's because I'm really good at my job. I will close out that part of the conversation too by saying that Donato's right. A House with a Clock on Its Walls, I would go so far as to say it's one of the best kid-friendly horror films you'll ever find. And I say that as somebody who doesn't like Eli Roth either. So it's that right balance of it works on one level for kids. It gives them a message about fitting in and about dealing with grief and sadness that's really good. Eli Roth throws in some weird visuals for the adults as well. It'll be a good standby for you, I think, at some point. So,
but you'd never know it's Eli Roth. I mean, that's the other thing too. Like, we all know of Eli Roth, but yeah,
you would, just because it's a little bit more bloody than a lot of those. Like, there are little moments, like with the books flying off the shelf and everybody gets paper cuts as opposed to just like being chased by books. Like, there's those little things that you're like, oh, here's somebody that was like, can I do this? No, I'm going to do it anyways. You can't do that. Okay. Can we keep it? Like, there's a little bit of that going on.
Fair. I'll give you that then. I just meant more in the, this isn't the Green Inferno, Eli Roth. This is very much the Eli Roth that is playing to a family crowd. And you're kind of like, oh, you can do this too. Wow. Okay.
Yeah, that's good to know. And I was going to say, with both of you guys and your divulging tastes in horror both coming together on that movie has me pretty sold to check it out. So I might have to report back to you guys.
Yeah, I don't know if we figured out what it means when Donato and I agree on something, but
it means the worst. It means that hell is frozen over and the end is near.
But I feel like that's a good segue into today's film, where I think we actually agreed on something. So let's talk about Party Hard, Die Young. And what did we agree the last party of your life is the actual literal translation of the German title?
Which
the final party of your life. Should have been that. I'm not criticizing you guys, Shudder. You should have changed it, whatever. Party Hard, Die Young is a 2018, released in 2019, Austrian horror film. It is about a group of teenagers who are in their final year of their equivalent of high school. And every year it's tradition for them, for this school, and for other kids around the country to send them to go off to Croatia. There's an island in Croatia where they throw like this big rage party. What is it? X-Force?
X-Jam.
X-Jam, which is a real party, and they get a very nice call out in the opening credits to say that a lot of these scenes were filmed at the real life X-Jam. So think of like the equivalent in the United States of going to Florida for spring break. This is the equivalent for them. This group of high school students goes to this party, lots of alcohol, lots of drugs, lots of sex. They're having a good time. It's sort of their last bash before they start to go off to other places like Vienna or Munich for college, and the kind of this core group of high school friends splits up. And then the main character, Julia's friend, Jessie, goes missing. And as they're trying to figure out what happened to her, another one of the friends goes missing. And progressively throughout the course of this film that's taking place on this giant party island with thousands of teenagers, all in the middle of like one prolonged rave, all of these kids start to go missing. There are little throwbacks to like 90s slashers where they're getting text messages instead of phone calls. They're getting Snapchats instead of phone calls, because I guess that's all we had back then. But just the way that this killer is sort of playing with them, it becomes apparent that there is something in their shared history that is making them the targets of what's going on. And from there, Party Hard, Die Young is your typical teenage slasher. Some people die, some people live. There are stories to tell and lots of creative and violent kills. Now, before we talk about this, I should note that this movie has 3 reviews on Rotten Tomatoes. 2 of them are fresh and 1 of them are rotten. And I think it's important going forward that we share just a little bit of Matt Donato's prose with our listeners, since he is one of the reviews of pretty much everything that we have here. So here's the Rotten Tomatoes call out for Party Hard, Die Young. Matt Donato wrote, copious narcotics, underdeveloped cranial capacities, a masked murderer who refuses to forget what you did last summer. Punch your ticket to this vicious vacation from hell. Matt Donato, what were you thinking when you wrote that?
I was probably drunk.
Fair enough. The end of the podcast.
That's how I can answer most things. No, I don't know. I just try to make it somewhat inviting when I write about things, or at least pique some kind of curiosity. So why not make a 90s slasher pun in my Rotten Tomatoes quote? Also, I just try to post the most ridiculous things on Rotten Tomatoes. It's a game to me. So that's just where I'm going for.
It's pretty good. Let's talk about Party Hard, Die Young. And let's start, Ryan, with you. This was your selection, actually. You went through kind of the list of movies, a running list that we keep of films that have 5 or fewer Rotten Tomato reviews, and this one jumped out at you. So what made you think I want to watch this film and then I want to talk about it?
Well, mostly because Shudder tried to get me to watch it for the last month. For those who don't know, the Shudder app for Xbox One and for Roku has 3 different streaming channels as opposed to just the one on the web browser. There's the It Came From Shudder web browser, or Jesus Christ, sorry, live stream. And that's like the one that you would find on your web browser. It's the one where like the Joe Bob Briggs marathons are and things of that sort. Then it's the Gulag Now for Halloween, but it was like a psychological thriller channel. And then there's a Slashix stream. And so for the last 6 weeks when I was on paternity leave and late at night when it was my turn to feed my son, I would just turn the Slashix channel on because I didn't have to think too hard. I didn't have to I didn't have to figure out what to watch. So I would just throw that stream on. And I learned even the month before that it's pretty much the same loop. Like it's the same 24-hour loop that plays on the Slashix channel. Like before he was born, I discovered like around a certain time of night, it would be like they'd play Pieces and then they'd play Madhouse and then Bloody Birthday. And that was like the September stream. And all through October, because it'd be the same time every night, I'd come in about the middle of Chopping Mall. And because I adore that movie, I would just let it finish till the very end. But of course, that's a 75-minute movie. So midway through it, you only have like 30 minutes left. And then the movie that followed it was Party Hard, Die Young. So I was watching little snippets as I was doing other things. But it looked intriguing to me, but I hadn't actually sat down to watch the whole thing. So when you guys shared the list to me, I think I even mentioned this on our Slack channel. I'm like, well, Shudder keeps trying to make me watch this movie, so I might as well actually just watch it. And so I did, and I liked it overall. It's a blender film for sure. It's like Spring Breakers meets Unfriended meets Prom Night / Terror Train / Slaughter High, like that specific whodunit slasher that involves teenagers, and I'm kind of trying to tiptoe around spoilers for people here, but that involves something that went wrong at some time. So it's definitely a mix of that. But what I really appreciated about it is it's so hard post Scream to make a decent slasher movie. We know the tropes and Scream, and then furthermore, I Know What You Did Last Summer, which is name checked in this movie. Any of those Kevin Williamson ones that are just like, they exposed the tropes, they sent them up, and it's been really difficult. And so it's difficult to make a straightforward one. But then conversely, on like the worst end of the spectrum is like, if your slasher script isn't working, people tend to throw meta or self-referential aspects into it to be like, well, maybe if we point out our flaws, it will absolve us of them. And that doesn't really work either. And so it was nice to watch one that was like very, like, it's trope heavy. Like, this movie doesn't reinvent the wheel by any stretch of the word, but it executes its tropes to the best of its ability. It introduces new technology, a la something like Unfriended. Like, I think Monocle, you already set it up where there's Instagram and Snapchat and things of that sort. And I think that's all really done well and stylish and in a pretty cool way. And the mystery is actually genuinely engaging. I think the only thing that I wouldn't even say brings it down, but the only thing that it definitely brings over from some of its ancestors from the 80s is there's definitely an aggressive mean-spiritedness to this movie. Like, most of the characters are extremely unlikable, and it takes turns, and we reveal things about certain characters that is just like inexcusable. And granted, like, the movie doesn't absolve them of the things they've done. Again, I'm going to try and tiptoe around spoilers, but like, that's maybe the only thing is I'm just like, I don't really care about 95% of these characters, but as a genre exercise, I was pretty impressed with it.
Yeah, and I think to piggyback off that, I'll just jump in really quick. What works for me and what impressed me the first time watching Party Hard Die Young is that, yes, it doesn't reinvent the wheel, but it modernizes the wheel so well. It takes those 80s and 90s tropes and it's able to make a version of a slasher that we don't get to see very often anymore. As you've already said, it's hard to make a slasher post Scream, but you can still do it. I mean, we were still getting slashers of this kind of mean-spirited nature, and pretty much until 2012, I want to say. I keep thinking about Stephen Miller's Silent Night remake, and that being one of the last times I really saw a slasher that felt ingrained in that slasher culture that once ruled the horror genre. And after that, it all kind of went downhill. And, we could talk about the reasons of why that happened. People started getting away from these mean-spirited films, as, we keep saying it, but it is. I mean, the also thing playing against that attitude is it being an international film, and especially being German. They're a little more blunt and they don't really care as much about the PC policing than I think has kind of, I'm not by any means saying it's bad. I'm not by any means trying to be out here saying like, oh, social justice warriors, blah, blah, blah. But, in American cinema and culture, we've taken a little harder stance on maybe saying a word like, faggot or something like that, which, this film does use once or twice. And there are some thoughts, not thoughts, but there are some themes that play in a world of like, all right, this is kind of dicey material, but it also fits the world. It fits these teenagers. These are dumb kids. They haven't come to terms with these kind of things yet and had to think about, what they're saying and what they're doing. And that's kind of what this film is about too. It's about these hateable characters being faced with some kind of decision from their past. And we see it all play out in real time. And I think for as mean-spirited as it is, it has to be, because that also plays into the climax. That plays into the realization that these kids finally have. This is their Rumspringa. This is their one getaway before they finally become quote unquote adults and go to college. So it's all part of this undercurrent that pushes these kids through some kind of character development that surprisingly I found. I don't know. It just really worked for me in a way that you took the dumb slasher formula, you added some Snapchat, you added some modern technology, which sure, okay, many films do, but you kept me guessing the whole time and you kept me going on this journey with the deaths, with the narration. I was impressed.
Yeah, and I think so first of all, I think we should talk a little bit about the ending, because I think it's hard to talk about this movie for all the reasons you kind of outlined, Donato, without discussing the secret, the thing that is the reason why these kids are getting killed. So now is your opportunity to turn off the podcast if you don't want to hear about the end of Party Hard, Die Young. If you're sticking around near the end of the film, and it's teased throughout some of the chase sequences by a video that's playing, the killer leaves a phone with this video of them from 2 years ago in high school that plays. And every time we watch it, we get to see a little bit more, and we're starting to piece the thing together. And it turns out that one of the characters, two of the characters in this group of friends, they had a weekend getaway in a cabin with a bunch of folks. And there was this kind of awkward girl who was trying to join the group. They played a game of truth or dare with her. She said dare. They sent her 7 minutes in heaven or whatever in the closet. And it turns out that two of the members, the two broiest, douchiest members of the group, used that as an excuse to sexually assault and rape this woman. And she eventually left that high school, the group of friends, because they're high school students, kind of didn't really think too much about that after it happened. And they find out a few years later that the girl actually succumbed to her trauma and killed herself. And the killer is revealed to be her older brother, who's one of the staffers at this big party that is kind of getting justice on her behalf. Now, here's why all of that is important in my eyes and what makes this sort of an interesting movie. To me, for all the reasons that we've talked about, it's smart, it's flashy, it has, I don't think likable characters, but it has believable and authentic characters, which is important to any slasher. All of that is true, and all of that makes Party Hard, Die Young interesting to watch. The thing that really is going to make this something I think we're going to see a lot of writing about in the future is this movie sort of feels like it exists at this intermediary stage between 90s and 80s slashers and the idea that these traumas that happened to somebody that, they had to face it, but, it was okay because they overcame somebody that was acting as sort of an avenger and the other person. And sort of this contemporary era we live in where things like Brett Kavanaugh happen, where somebody is being held accountable and should be held accountable for actions that happened decades ago, things that they did when they were, quote, just a teenager. that is going to have an effect on how we tell these stories and how slashers address sort of this justice, this childhood trauma, lived trauma angle. And I think that this is a movie that is sort of a little bit in both camps. It knows that 80s and 90s movies exist. It obviously name drops I Know What You Did Last Summer, and it operates on a very basic level as one of those slashers. But there is a thread in this of the fact that these characters are unlikable, that it isn't looking for redemption, it isn't looking for salvation. It doesn't pay that off entirely in the end, but there is this idea that these kids did a bad thing and that they are getting what's coming to them, and it's not just something that they need to band over and overcome because, hey, they were 15 when it happened, that there are some ramifications for this. This feels like a movie that is going to be seen by somebody who's eventually going to make something really interesting, or at least it's going to sort of push this subgenre of slashers into an interesting direction.
I think that's the biggest key to the movie, which you had already laid out perfectly. You know, I guess we're talking about the ending, and is, you know, in those 80s and 90s slashers, even if something as horrific as this event had happened, the killer, the slasher, quote unquote, would still be the one demonified and the one that needs to be taken out, which does happen in this movie. But the thing that I appreciate most about it is that the two bro douchebags that you already referred to are not let off the hook. That they are going, you know, they'll go to a hospital to heal their wounds, and then they're going to jail. Or at least that's what it seemed like at the end of the movie. That they're being held accountable for the things that they have done. And so, like, that layer makes this movie fascinating. If it was just another there's this killer who's killing people for reasons, and then we find out reasons and they still have to be taken out. I mean, think about Friday the 13th, where it's like, yeah, it's traumatic. It's certainly traumatic what happened to Mrs. Voorhees losing her son and whatnot, but it's like she's still the one vilified by the end of that movie. Like, and the campers are still the ones sort of redeemed. And I feel like this one really flips that on its head, where, you know, certain people may be, you know, no one is really redeemed, even the people who were unaware of the specifics of what happened to this young girl. They are still held accountable by association because they allowed that situation to happen. And that's, I think, what makes this more than just a really entertaining, stylish, modern update of the template, and, like you said, something to make it move forward. And I think that's what really, really got me by the end.
I think so. Specifically, I want to talk about the character of Cheesy really quick. His nickname is obviously Cheesy, but he is the character in every horror movie that is made fun of by all the girls in the group. He's just trying to get laid the whole time, but he's doing it awkwardly and always getting brushed off. And in a lot of other horror movies, and this is why I think Party Hard Die Young learns a little bit from not mistakes, but the times of the past and how we viewed those characters. Cheesy would have been comedic relief. Cheesy would have been about all the jokes. We see him like masturbating at one point. It's like a cutaway because one of the girls goes like, "You're never going to get laid by one of us." And then a cutaway to him like jerking off in the shower just to prove it. And it's like, yeah, so he's the quote unquote sad guy that'll never get the girl in the end. But the things that he does as he keeps going, he makes these lewd comments. He's being a little leery and not predatory, but it's definitely not okay what he's doing. And eventually he's used as a red herring, because we already talked about the ending. We know who the killer is. He's used as one of the red herrings along the way to say like, oh, what if Cheesy's the killer? Because he just, you know, he's one of these sad sacks turned into a slasher villain because he'll never get what he wants in the end. But the way they do that, and the way that they still make him held accountable for what he's done, because he gets in trouble because of exactly how he's treated these girls the whole time and what he's done this whole time. And it's a little bit of a learning experience versus in many other slasher films and lesser slasher films in this modern era that don't understand as much. Cheesy just would have been another character that probably either dies or survives until the end. And it's never addressed that what he's doing is kind of skeevy and kind of not okay. But at least in Party Hard Die Young, he might be used as a red herring, but it's a red herring that comes with some kind of circumstance and some kind of like situational awareness.
Yeah, he would have been like, what's his name? Shelly in Friday the 13th Part 3. Like,
right.
One that's like playing pranks and comes on way too strong and creepy. Yeah, I hear what you're saying for sure.
Yeah, so I think that just gives it a little bit more of an edge there. And yeah, so Matt, you can go with that though.
Well, I wrote down like Crispin Glover and underlined it like 4 different times throughout the course of the movie.
That's a
good.
really, yeah, it's a really good comparison right there.
Austria has found its Crispin Glover wannabe. The entire country can rest. You found who you were looking for. Yeah, and Donato, to the point that you were making too, there's that whole introductory sequence too about Denise and Carmen, and Denise is sort of the mean girl of the group, and Carmen is the one that the group sort of identifies as having body issues, that she's not as pretty or as thin as the rest of them. And the movie does take that as an opportunity to sort of flip the script. Carmen has kind of a moment of empowerment at Denise's expense that eventually she kind of goes to her head and deals with it in an interesting way as well. So I don't think that Party Hard Die Young has the answers to all of the questions that it's asking about teenagers and, more importantly, teenagers in horror films, because I think this movie is much more engaged with teenagers in horror films than it is, actual teenagers that are out there in the world. This is a movie that it's engaging with its own genre in a way that's really interesting. I don't necessarily think that you would come away, unless you're, I don't know what your life experience would be if you watch this and go, oh my God, that's exactly what teenagers are like. But I think it does an interesting job of sort of playing with those conventions, playing with the way that we expect these archetypes to unfold over the course of the movie. We immediately, because we have a history with slashers, start to bucket the characters. And then the way that the movie says, these buckets that you put them in are kind of correct, but these characters don't really fit. And also the fact that you put them in that bucket was sort of shitty to begin with. It has a way of doing that to kind of make this a little bit smarter, make this a little bit more engaging. I don't think it pays it off particularly well in the end. I think it lets a lot of characters off the hook in a way that it might not have, but at least it's asking those questions, and at least it's trying to work with those depictions, and that makes it that makes it surprising. It makes it if you are one of those people that says, well, the slasher just can't be relevant in 2019, I'm going to point to this and say, it's right around the corner. 30 years nostalgia hype. We're going to get a wave of Kevin Williamson wannabe stuff, and if it manages to follow in this footsteps, I think we're going to be okay.
And that's why I wanted to brought up mentioning it being like a blender movie of multiple things put together. And that's why I wanted to bring in Spring Breakers as a comparison, not just from the standpoint that they're teenagers at this big rave party or anything like that, but like, Korean's film is this very like dark satire on a generation raised by popular culture and the sort of, how that affects people, how that affects young minds, how that I'm sorry, I'm losing my thought here, but like there's a comparison to be made, I think, with those two movies. Like that movie certainly lets characters off the hook to a point, to like a greater point. But I think like this movie plays in that sandbox a little bit more than just the slasher sandbox. Like it is trying to get at something greater. And like you said, it doesn't totally stick the landing in the ending, but the fact that some of these characters are not completely left off the hook is more than enough to recommend it.
Yeah, it's actually kind of interesting to look at who gets the nastiest treatments in this film if we're talking about the slasher deaths. Because Matt, as you said before, the two rapists they are dealt with in a certain way that relates to what they've done, and they are left very, very battered both emotionally and physically, but they're alive at the end of it. And yet there's this other character named Lukey, and not only is he killed very graphically and tortured, but then during the end credits we see his body again, and it's kind of like Lukey was like passed out drunk the whole time. And I know that's a commentary on like, even if you're there and not aware, you're still part of what happens. But it takes the most aggression out on this poor guy that was, passed out drunk during the actions, but he gets the worst death. And the people who actually did the very, very wrong act, they're left alive at the end of it. It's just an odd commentary, like you were saying, Matt.
Yeah, it's definitely a film that it is a horror film that is almost more interested in the people that stand by and watch than the people that perpetrate, right? The old story about the woman that screamed in the alley as she was being stabbed to death, and all the neighbors didn't, open the windows or call 911 or something like this. It's a horror film, I think, for those people, that condemns those people that heard those and ignored them rather than did something about it. And it's rare, I think, to see usually all of the kills in a movie like this are done to affect the primary, or the person that the killer has identified as the primary culprit, right? Like the friends that die or the people that die are there to fuck with the main character who is, has that connection to it or did something. It's more in relation to that. And these characters are getting picked off on their own merit for their inability to have made a difference at a time when they should have. And that's worth noting.
So the one thing I will say though is even with all these different kind of treatments that we're talking about, and maybe the one character is getting brutalized while the people who survive have done the bad acts, and maybe the payoff isn't as good as you wanted, Matt. But I will say, in this era of not having that many slashers, not only was I very impressed by the way they narrated the story throughout and the way that they kept a mystery going with all these red herrings, because there's multiple characters throughout the film that we think could take the mantle of being the slasher villain, because he has a mask on the whole time, the happy face mask. But not only does it do that well, I think that it kept me guessing, and I didn't even see the ending coming. So maybe the payoff wasn't great, but I think the reveal at the end, it's better than I was expecting from a film of this nature. Like, it's sold as, the name is Party Hard, Die Young. It's sold as one of these fun cash grabs for slasher fans, but I don't know. I think it sticks the landing as far as revealing who the killer is and keeping us until the very last moment. Then we go, oh shit, this all makes sense now.
Well, the mechanics are certainly set up very well. Like that's definitely one of the strengths of the movie, is that it does, because of the slow sort of reveal of the Anna character and what's going on there, and then them coming to grips, and then the fact that it bounces through. It goes from being like, saying, oh, this person could be the killer and this person could be the killer. I do think in the mechanics that way, in the way you're saying, definitely keeps enough on your toes. It's just more, it's grander sort of thematic statement on the way of the world doesn't quite stick the landing. But in terms of actual like slasher mechanics, because like we've already, I think, prefaced many times already on this episode of just like, we already know the conventions, we know the tropes, and the fact that this movie does a good job of being surprising every step of the way, even though we've seen a million of these before, is certainly to the movie's credit. So no, I agree with what you're saying, Donato, in terms of the mechanics of the movie. It's just more those grander themes don't quite stick.
Yeah, I mean, the themes are dodgy, but as you just said, getting there is part of the issue in a slasher film. And how many quote unquote modern slashers, because they do exist. There are, your laid to rest movies. There are your indie slashers that are trying to come up here, the Hatchets and whatnot. People are trying to make slashers, but the hard part for a lot of these is either keeping the killer a secret or making us care enough in the mystery that's going on. The whodunit aspect of this, I think it's like one of the better slashers that we actually get the payoff of the mechanics at the end. And I would also put it up there with another Shudder slasher that is also an original called Lake Bodom. And these are both international. These are both well-structured slasher movies in a time that we are not getting them. And I would definitely recommend them as a double feature if you really want to see where that slasher renaissance could possibly come from in the next few years.
Interesting. I'll have to seek that one out. And the other thing to the movie's credit too is, as someone who does frequent a lot of slashers from that heyday, I tend to check out whatever gets remastered by someone like Arrow Video or Vinegar Syndrome or any of those boutique labels. One thing to this movie's credit too is there's not a lot of filler, which is there's a problem with a lot of some of those older slashers, that it's like, even if the shot on filmness of it is gorgeous and the restoration looks gorgeous, even if the practical effects are very good and there's some really creative deaths, there's a lot of these slashers that just like take place in the woods because they didn't need a film permit to shoot there, and there's just a bunch of filler of people fucking around in the woods and nothing happens for a very, very long time. And so credit to Party Hard, Die Young for actually like actually keeping its pace and using its story and keeping you on your toes, as opposed to just like, boring you in between the kills that happen.
Yeah.
And
oh, go ahead.
I'm gonna jump in and actually say that, we always talk on this podcast that, we can have intelligent conversations about horror and kind of the social impact and what it's trying to say and how it relates to what's going on in the world. But we also talk about horror as an entertainment genre and, something that's engaging with the body of work that's come before and what slasher fans are looking for. And so I'm gonna close the door on the smart talk. We had some good smart talk, and we talked about like the social ramifications. And I think we should kind of, to where you were headed already, Matt, talk about this from the genre standpoint, from like how are the kills, how are the red herrings, like the things that we know and love about something like a slasher. And I do agree with you 100%. And one of the things that I feel like these have gotten away from is believable red herrings. It sort of seems like a lot of horror films understand that you can't reveal the killer until the end, but they don't do the work in order to set other people up as a killer. Like usually you'll come around a corner and somebody will be all bug-eyed or something and be like, oh, I guess they might be the killer because, they're looking weird at this moment. But it's a testament to how well this movie understands the shittiness of being a teenager, the secrets that you have, like all of those things that teenagers do in horror movies and how they interconnect with each other, that there are at least 4 people in this film that are suspected at one time or another. And when each of them are introduced, you're sort of like, totally, 100%. Makes sense in the context of this film, makes sense in the context of slashers as a broader subgenre. If that's the killer, I'm not going to be disappointed.
Yeah, and I mean, even before we get into that super quick, I mean, no, not even that we have to get any farther into that, because I agree with you 100%. But I just want to bring up like the cinematography too. I think this is a beautiful film to behold. And this is coming from the director of Attack of the Lederhosen Zombies, was his last movie. And that's also...
Hold on, Matt. Can I interrupt you? Attack of the Lederhosen Zombies, our own Matt Donato wrote in 2017, Attack of the Lederhosen Zombies doesn't quite live up to its eye-catching name, but still offers enough undead snowboarding mayhem worth a horror laugh.
I was just going to say, which is a very fun movie that you should check out if the name alone makes you go, what the hell? It's not as good as A Dead Snow, but it's still a blast. There's like zombies that get catapulted in half by snowboards and crap like that. Like I said, Matt just read my quote. That's fine. Go see it. But okay, so Attack of the Lederhosen Zombies, full out fun, but it wasn't really the kind of first feature I would expect to translate into Party Hard Die Young, because this is a very like mature film, I would say. Attack of the Lederhosen Zombies, definitely a first time feature, definitely something you look at and you can see the indie budget and the cinematography, everything that goes along with it. It's a certain kind of quality. But watching Party Hard Die Young, it just all comes together so cleanly. All these shots of like Tomorrowland kind of esque neons, and it's all these rave sequences and the party aspects. It's shot so beautifully, and I loved watching it just on that kind of like neon saturation level of just getting lost in this like weird universe that you don't. These are kids partying under a regulated environment. Like they're being told, hey, you get a week in Croatia, just go crazy. Like their parents know they're there. Everyone knows they're there. It's known what they're doing. And like as an American, it's just so funny to watch because like I went right to work literally like 2 days after I graduated college. There was no downtime. The whole idea is kind of like, oh, good, you graduated. Great. Now go get a job. Like this kind of environment was so foreign to me. But the way that Dominic Hartel shoots it, I think it's just picture perfect for a teen slasher. I can't talk about it like on a level beyond how did this guy pull it off?
Totally. There's 2 things I wanted to speak to on what you just mentioned. Number one, I did look up the director after watching the movie to see what else he had done, and seen he did this Attack of the Lederhosen Zombies, and it is on Prime Video. I noticed. I considered watching it last night. Ultimately didn't, but I went to go check my my Letterboxd page. So I'm like, I wonder if any of my mutuals have watched it, and there was only one, and it was Donato. And I'm like, of course he's seen this movie.
I mean, I have a brand, man. This is what I do.
You are nothing if not on brand. But I'm glad you mentioned the cinematography, because that's something I wanted to talk of in like the greater context of the slasher genre, and specifically the sort of downfall of the genre post Scream. I'm not like pure celluloid fetish by any stretch of the word, but especially like Matt, you already kind of referred to like the indie slashers and some of those even lower budget modern slashers, especially the ones that were in like the late 90s to early 2000s, where digital started becoming new, but it was like mini DV tapes from like the Dogma 95 movement, and like unless it was done in a like, I guess, quote unquote artistic way, like the stuff Lars von Trier and some of the early Harmony Korine were doing, just that type of digital looks awful. And as opposed to its like 80s and early 90s brethren, bad looking film still looks like film, whereas like bad digital looks like unwatchable. And so I feel like that also kind of played a part in the decline of the genre, not just Scream poking fun of the tropes, but then they were making them on these smaller budgets and they looked really terrible and the effects were terrible and they're just, were not enjoyable to watch. And so it was refreshing seeing something like this that, I mean, it clearly had a budget. I have no idea what the budget for the movie is, but to be able to mimic a large like Paradiso looking festival, had to take some money. But it is really stylish and it's very, very well shot. And I was impressed from that aspect for sure.
Yeah, one of my Twitter followers, Garrett Smith at Philadelphia, he refers to the kind of color saturation that's used in this film as Pop-Tart saturation, which I love because basically the idea is like take a wild berry Pop-Tart in those colors and turn that into a color filter. And that's like Donato reds are a thing for me. I love the red color filter. That's his. And I get it after watching Party Hard Die Young because my God, there's some sequences where it's either a rave or there's even one shot where you get the main character, Julia. She's walking down this neon lit pathway and it's in the woods. So you get the neon lights down the path and you get in the background just those purples and pinks and these like dark saturated blues just all coming together. And the way the camera follows her, it's almost like this Alice in Wonderland shit where it just doesn't seem real. She's in her own little world and she is on drugs. So you get the hallucinogenic aspect of that too. But my God, I just loved watching it. I loved every minute of that. So I really can't stress enough how cinematography is so important, even in a slasher film. I know we watch these for the deaths, and I'll happily talk about the deaths in a minute or two. But when you actually have something with quality on the other technical aspects, people that are out there that think like horror is only a one-note genre. Oh, it's just people that like watching people die. Bullshit. Like, this is filmmaking. This is freaking beautiful.
All right, last question before we wrap up on this film then. Let's talk about the death sequences because I think this is the one place where you could make an argument that the film doesn't quite deliver. It doesn't have the most creative original deaths, but I do think that it has deaths that are appropriate for the characters and what they've done. But, I don't know if you would necessarily put any of these kills in like a YouTube compilation or anything like that. There's just not like the flash there that I was expecting, which in my opinion makes it a bit better because it makes it a bit more grounded. But what do you think?
Well, allow me to retort quite quickly because I know you said you wouldn't put it in a compilation or anything like that, but I am currently working on my favorite kills of the year for the new issue of Fangoria, and I definitely used Lukey's bottle death because I know you don't like see the bottle go in and anything like that, and it may not be the most inventive practical effect, but I think watching his death, so like he's chained up first and the duct taped hands around a hook, so he's hanging, and the killer is first just like pouring vodka or some kind of clear liquor down his throat, recreating his blacked out self during the Truth or Dare game. But the way that you're watching him struggle throughout the whole thing, and you think he's going to get out and you think it's going to be some kind of fight where he might escape and he might turn the tide somehow. But what ends up happening is the killer keeps putting the bottle neck further and further into Lukey's mouth. So he's just guzzling at this point. And the minute he gets his hands free and the tape rips, he's basically like passing out from like alcohol poisoning and goes face first. And the bottle just goes right in, like farther into his mouth and kills him that way. I don't know. I thought that shot was pretty disturbing when you cut back to Lukey and he's just face down with that bottle halfway in his mouth, like a full bottle of vodka we're talking about here, not like a flask or anything. And it's halfway in there and the blood's coming into the bottle. And then you see his body during the final credits when everything's supposed to be happy and everything's supposed to be wrapped up. you go back and his body's still sunken, chained up on the bottom of the ocean floor. I don't know. I think it worked for me.
But Matt, to me, you just said it right there. You said when you cut back, you see. You can't cut back on a best kill. You can't kill. You can't do the kill off camera,
There's
man.
more to a kill than just the act itself.
Yeah, imagine if like the first Maniac, in the original Maniac anyway, that like when Tom Savini's head explodes, that they cut away from that, and then we show like the aftermath of the head. It just wouldn't work. It just wouldn't work.
Well, that's true. Okay, I totally get your point there, and I know there's the cutaway, but I still think the cutback is still effective enough. I still think seeing the bottle that lodged in his mouth, and again the blood going into the vodka that's still there, and then the gruesomeness of his bloated corpse just on the bottom of the ocean, like I said, on the bottom of the Croatian ocean floor, which is so beautiful. And there's Lukey just tied up and discolored and all this other stuff. I don't know. I think that worked for me as a full encapsulating kill. But I don't know. I think it works well for the kills because you're in the party atmosphere. They were all kills that were manageable within getting away with them and not getting caught. Because like you don't have time to do this elaborate kill sequence like a jigsaw trap or something like that. I don't know.
Well, and I think that's, I think to what Monocle had already said too, I think that's what, even though I don't think there are particularly, I agree. I think that one's maybe the more memorable one solely because we do see that in the end credits. It's kind of like one last cruel joke towards the end. But I think because they are, even though there's nothing that particularly stands out to me on this, but you already mentioned that they're feasible within the world that the film sets up. And that's just, that's verisimilitude. That's good filmmaking. And to me, would I like to have a slasher movie that's both good and has also good, like memorable deaths? Yes. But if my option is a good slasher story with deaths that are kind of like, okay, like this one, or they have tremendous death sequences, but the movie is really boring and not interesting or engaging whatsoever, I'll certainly take something more like this. So I'm more in the camp of they don't really, they aren't the most outstanding in the world, but it works in service of the story, and I think that's the most important thing. So that's where I land on the deaths for this movie.
Yeah, I definitely think that these are the right deaths for these characters in this film, and I think it's better because of it. I think it might have distracted if they went really, really big or flashy or elaborate with some of the death sequences. So I actually think that's in the movie's favor, the fact that the deaths are a little subdued and a tiny bit off camera. But yeah, I know there are people out there that'll watch that and be like, oh, that was it? Like, why didn't I get to see shit? And so, want to make you aware if you're listening and you want the on-camera glory of a practical special effects style death, you might not get that with this film.
And I think
depending on how you feel about Donato's bottle sequence.
Right. And I think what also works in the film's favor is everything we talked about with the technical merit of it and the storytelling. And, we're engrossed in this film. And maybe on a lesser slasher entry, I'd be more worried about the kills. Not that I do care about the kills in Party Hard, Die Young, but I would be more noticeable of the cutaways and the things of this nature if I wasn't engrossed by so many other facets of this cinema. So I think I give it more credit maybe because of this, but yeah, no, I'll kind of agree with you that I would have loved to see maybe when Denise falls from the roof and she falls onto that table with the spike coming out of it. And again, it's a cutaway. We see her falling, we look away, some blood splatters, and we come back and then she's impaled. Other films have done the impalement. Jason X, when you see a body literally twirling down like a giant screw that's just in this spaceship. But yeah, I'll give you that.
Well, normally this is the part on the show where we would decide kind of collectively whether or not this movie deserves to be remembered or forgotten. I think we're all in agreement that this is a movie that deserves to be remembered. So let's ask a different question of the group then. What do you think has to happen for this to be a new canon type horror film in, let's say, 10 years? If there's some 14-year-old aspiring Matt Donato out there who's putting together listicles of all the great underseen horror films, what is it? What do you think will have had to happen? Who will have had to latch on to this movie in order for this to top the list of, oh, you never saw this 2019 gem, like it's a a hidden classic, and eventually become part of what people think of as the new era of slashers.
Can I just start this conversation really quickly by saying I'm kind of surprised that there are only 3 Rotten Tomatoes reviews. It played multiple festivals. It played Brussels International. It played Morbido, which are both genre festivals and in their own rights. It played Brooklyn Horror. So it's not like this movie didn't do its rounds. And I mean, looking at the people who did review it, like it's me and then two other people I do know, but not a single quote unquote major publication picked this title up. And it went to Shudder. It's not like it just died on VOD or stuff like that. I feel like there's such a community love for Shudder at this point that even the most base level horror critics would have given it a shot in a review. I don't know. I'm just so curious how this doesn't have more than like even 10. I look at some of these films that have 10 Rotten Tomatoes reviews and maybe 1 or 2 top critics. Why not Party Hard Die Young? I don't know why this was passed on so like aggressively.
Yeah, I have to wonder the same thing. Like, yes, even though Shudder is, is pretty beloved at this point, I think people of our circles would be willing to give a chance to it. I think in terms of review, I mean, if it never popped up in an inbox or anything like that, or saw at a festival, then that makes sense to me. But the fact that it played other genre festivals that you've laid out is a little bit shocking that it only has 3 reviews. I certainly thought it would have had more until I saw your guys' list for potential episodes. And I'm like, oh, really? Like, I haven't seen this movie at the time, but I had heard of it. So and I knew it was a Shudder original title. So it's pretty shocking. And I know, I don't know necessarily if they give out links or anything. I don't want to get too like insider baseball-y on it, but I do know they pick up a lot of festival stuff, and most of the stuff they've picked up meet that 5 review requirement that would make them not eligible for this podcast. So yeah, it's kind of surprising that this one is that lone one. It's like, oh, it doesn't have a lot of reviews, and it's actually pretty solid.
Yeah, I'm fine talking insider baseball. I mean, we're all critics here, and part of the thing we do is we get screenings ahead of time so that we can have our reviews out for films that release. And I do remember promotion for Party Hard Die Young. I don't put this on Shudder at all, because I do remember emails coming through that were asking, do you want review content, stuff like that. And I just did a really quick Google while you were talking right there. And if this is correct, like I don't even see a review on Bloody Disgusting or Dread Central. So it's kind of like not even like the big horror sites reviewed it. And maybe I had to dig deeper really quickly. But again, upon looking really quickly, I don't see anything else, even from those kind of sites. So I just wonder how this fell through the cracks so mightily. And I'm baffled a little bit. I don't know. I do a lot of this reviewing indie horror, and I see a lot of films that are way less on the quality scale than Party Hard Die Young, and yet they still, again, they have at least 10, even 15 reviews sometimes.
Well, I'm gonna say 2 things, and I think these both speak to how this movie may not have gotten discovered and how it might get discovered later on. I think one, just to really put the nail in the head of the conversation we've been having, is that I don't think we know as an audience how to feel about slashers right now, because we're sort of caught between waves. I think that when we start to see more good slashers, more mainstream, high-profile good slashers, which you talk to anybody in the industry, they're kind of in agreement that they're coming, right? Like, this is something that a lot of people are excited by, and there's going to be a lot of these. And the kind of lower tier, the lower budget stuff, Donato, that you're already covering, I mean, we're seeing them bubble up already. So we're moving back towards a wave of slasher films, which I think will be favorable to this. And I think it comes back to the very beginning of when we were talking about this. I just don't think it's a particularly good title. And I think that when you're at a genre festival and you see something like Party Hard or Die Young, and you know that there are a lot of other titles out there, no disrespect, it's a translation. I'm sure there were good reasons for it, but it feels like the kind of title for a type of movie which this isn't. And I think that probably turned a lot of people off. I think that there were a lot of folks that saw this and were like, I know what this is. I don't need to see it. And they missed out on something that was better for it.
Yeah, I would have to agree on the title. It doesn't really, it sounds pretty generic, the movie doesn't really reflect that, but it is a very generic title, and it's very easy to say pass. I do agree. I think that wave is like, good slashers are coming. I think the big sort of, I think the one that's going to push it through, even, knowing nothing about it, is is James Wan's new movie that he's directing. I don't remember the title of it off the top of my head, but he said it's a giallo, and giallo and slasher pretty much go hand in hand. And if it's a black glove, big knife kind of giallo, I think that's going to be the one to spearhead this new era of slashers in.
Not to put too much pressure on the Black Christmases of the world too, but this whole subgenre really depends on whether or not y'all get it right. So no pressure.
No pressure.
Yeah, and I think the answer to how do we make this not forgotten anymore? How do we get this out to the public? I think the three of us just have to write our, some kind of feature on why Party Hard Die Young is the turning point for slasher cinema and what it could mean for the future.
And if you're listening and you write that before us, God damn you straight.
Actually, please write this before me because I don't have the time.
Not
watch Party Hard Die Young. I want you to like it, and then I want you to write about it. I mean, that's the thing, asking like how do we get these films out in the public and like how do people discover it? I think it going to Shudder should have been enough of a discovery on its own, because too many indie horror films don't go to Shudder and don't go to things like this. Maybe if you go straight to Amazon Prime, you get a little bit of that immediate watchability and immediate viewership, but I don't know. This went Shudder. This went exactly where it needed to go, and yet people still aren't really talking about it.
Yeah, I mean, I'd argue even the Prime Video route wouldn't even be the best, because Shudder, you have curation. You have people actually carefully curating and specifying it towards their audience. So if you're an indie horror film and you want to get eyes on you, Shudder really is the way to go. And who knows? People aren't talking about it, but people certainly may be watching it. I mean, it's a big world, so we don't know necessarily. But all we do know is, like, in the circles we travel, no one is talking about it. And that's kind of a shame. So yeah, maybe we're the ones who have to do it. Maybe somebody listening will watch it and go, hey, these guys are onto something, and write something on it. As Matt said, please do. All three of us are busy. So if you have the time to do it, do it.
We don't have the time for this crap.
but we did have the time to watch it and discuss it. And I'm very grateful for that. And I'm grateful that it was on your guys' list. I love this show. I've been listening to it since you guys started it. And it's certainly tough because, it's hard going through these movies that don't have as many reviews on Rotten Tomatoes, and you're looking for that diamond in the rough. And sometimes you get it, and other times you're just kind of watching not even a bad movie, just kind of a middle of the road movie. And so I think, whether it's a full blown diamond or just a nugget of one, I think we found one here with this movie.
I agree. Well, Ryan, since you've pumped us up a little bit, I suppose we should probably let people know how they can contact you. It seems only fair. If they're interested in reading more of your writing, if they're interested in your upcoming episodes of the Playlist podcast, how do they follow you? What social media is good? What do you want? What are you talking? What's happening?
What's happening? Twitter's probably the best place to find me. You can find me at Ryollie90. That's RYOLLIE 90. I do occasionally write stuff for the playlist, but I mostly do the Discourse podcast over the Playlist Podcast Network, of which both Matthews here have been on the show. So I suggest you check that out. Because as Monagle pointed out, I am a new father, so I'm a little bit behind on episodes, but we should have one in the coming weeks to discuss Terminator. We'll probably have one on Dr. Sleep, and we'll probably do a catch up of Parasite, The Lighthouse, and Dolomite Is My Name. So be on the lookout for that. But yeah, Twitter's the best place to find me, and I'm on the playlist.
Awesome. First and most important, Matt, how do people follow you?
You can follow me at Donatobomb on Letterboxd, Instagram, and Twitter. You can also find my writing on places such as Slash Film, Flickering Myth, We Got This Covered, Collider, and some other websites that, I don't know, I just don't have time to list them all. So yeah, just follow the Twitter. I'll post it all there and beg you to read my work.
You can also follow me. I'm not quite as prolific as Donato, but I do my best. On Twitter, it's Labsplice, LABSPLICE. And Certified Forgot is this show and this podcast handle as well. Ryan, I want to say thanks so much for coming on the show. Had a great time talking about this movie. Matthew, will you please take us out in our usual manner?
Demon Way.
Goodbye.